They kill them.
Tornadoes.
Tornadoes is a bad example.
Okay, rare.
Trees can resist bark beetles better if they're thin. But I was just at Camp Navajo this morning, and there's some big open savannas in there, and some of the biggest trees were taken out because they have huge crowns, you know? And the tornadoes either snapped them off or uprooted them, pulled them out of the ground. So, but these ideas of these things that one can do for restoration are part of what the Forest Partnership is interested in, the Forest Service, and part of what that Ponderosa Peak book is aimed at. So the book's not aimed at just, here's this terrible story about how everything's gotten worse. It's also, here's some things that you can do to make it better. But I did want to mention an important point that when you're talking to young kids, this idea that fire is good, when you guys said magic, I thought you were saying matches. Don't want the young kids in the audience to go start restoring the forest by themselves. So that kind of complicated message should maybe be part of it.
At what point is a forest considered overpopulated?
Well, see, that's a great question because, so let's say one forest on an acre has 100 trees and another has 1,000 trees. Well, what's good or what's bad?
Right.
So the way that scientists try to figure this out is by trying to understand the most natural points of reference that they can find. And a lot of times that's in the past. So like if we wanted to ask how often is fire natural, we might look at these kinds of examples and say, well, for several centuries at least, we can say the fire occurred like this often. We can do the same kind of thing with tree structure. So we can look at either evidence from, say, stumps of an area and see what the forest used to look like. We can go to a place like Grand Canyon National Park, which has never been harvested. The forest inside the park was protected from harvesting. And measure that forest and use that as a point of reference. And there's one more example that I brought a sample to show you guys. This is another fire-scarred sample from another kind of pine tree. This one stopped in 1870 just about, but this sample had fires in 1871, 1877, 1892, 1909, 1918, et cetera, up through 1989, and it burned again in 1998 after this sample was taken. This is from a forest in northern Mexico. So this is a place that ecologically is really similar to the forest in Arizona, but for cultural reasons, because it's in a different country that did not have these gigantic herds of livestock the same way, that didn't have the same kind of market economy associated with livestock or timber that we did, and so on, where this forest has continued to burn up to the present. And so we can study places like this too, and use all those things as examples and ideas of what kind of parameters to put around what constitutes a good number for forest density or for species composition.
How do you determine like whether an entire forest is healthy too? I mean, like 10 square acres could be this awesome, you have a nice like amount of old trees versus young trees and sort of good like understory growth. But like the next 10 acres, you could have a bunch of like really young trees and like no understory.
So Carrie, you feel like answering what makes a forest healthy?
What makes a forest healthy? I should know the answer to this. I think one of the most important things to remember when we're looking at a forest is you can't really define what is a forest. You have to put boundaries on things. So what we do in forestry is cut up the forest into smaller things that we call stands. And a stand would be a group of trees that are similar enough in nature that you can define them as one area. And when you go into a forest and you look at things on a smaller scale, you can start looking, over here I have a great stand of trees, I have a wonderful understory, and I have a little disease. But over here I have a stand of another 10 square acres that would actually be a huge stand, but that is not doing so well. And so when you go into it, you have to look at that. And there's so many different ways of looking at a healthy forest. You have the diversity of age classes, whether like around here, almost all of our trees are about the same age because of the regeneration that happened in the early 1900s. So you have things like biodiversity of the understory, but at the same time, is it too crowded in the overstory? Are all your trees competing for the same resources? Do you have diseases? Do you have funguses, which are natural? Some of them are natural, some of them are not. So there's defining a healthy forest is extremely complicated. One of the ways we try to strive for a healthy forest overall is getting things back to pre-development or pre-European settlement of the area. And right now, that is being done, at least in my short history in forestry and what I've understood, by taking out trees, thinning the forest. Because when you have fewer trees in the stand, those trees, sort of like what he was saying earlier about if there's a drought and you have a few trees over here, but you have a huge group of trees over here, if there's a drought, the few trees are going to be able to get more water. But if you're in a huge clump, they're going to be competing for those same resources. That is what makes competition, is when you're competing for limited resources. And so right now we're trying to thin areas down back to pre-settlement date type conditions, thank you. And because then when you have less competition, your trees can, I think, just strive where they can be more healthy. I think, is that at all what you're looking for?
That complexity that you're talking about is something that not everybody necessarily associates with the word health. And a lot of times we think of health like as us, as people, you know, so we're healthy, then we get sick. Well, our goal is to get rid of all those germs. We don't want, we're not worried about that there's some population of germs that we don't want to have go extinct or anything. We want to get them all out of there. But when you think about what makes a whole ecosystem, so an ecosystem is all the plants, all the animals, all the microbes, and their environment, the geology, the water, and all that. There has to be death as well as life. Everything can't live forever. There have to be things for other things to eat, and so on. So there are these cycles. You've studied, you know, how predators eat prey species and things like that, like how wolves or coyotes will chase rabbits and that kind of thing. Well, those cycles of life and death are important, and we need to understand as much as we can about them, and then basically keep them in balance. So an unhealthy forest is not one where there is no disease or there is no death, but rather that it's in balance with the new life, with the regeneration and growth that's also going on. And so, again, from some of these kind of points of reference, like natural forests, like national parks and things like that, we try to figure out what those balances are. And honestly, the biggest challenge to this whole thing in the future is climate change, because that's a gigantic driver that's affecting all these ecosystems at a rate. Climates have changed in the past. They just never changed this fast all at one time all over the world. And so that's going to be a huge challenge for sustaining natural ecosystems.
Yes, so also to put it in perspective, historic conditions, I believe there were about 20 to 80 trees an acre, somewhere in there, maybe not even that high, not even 80.
In the Ponderosa.
In the Ponderosa pine forest. And now, especially, there are areas where you have thousands of trees an acre. And when you see those trees, they're like this, they're teeny tiny, they're close together. You walk in there, it's totally dark. It's a place you don't want to be. That's unhealthy. You know, there are no grasses on the ground, and when you walk into these open stands, there are beautiful grasses and underneath, and there are wildflowers, and you used to be able, historically, before settlement, you could gallop a horse through these forests. That's how open they were. So just to give you that kind of picture, and I can send you a couple photos of to contrast the two, so that everybody can see them as well. I can email those to you. You might want to talk about boar too, because they may not know what that is, and that might be something you want to use in the script. Honestly, this is pretty neat.
Well, is my understanding then that we're using the Ponderosa Peat story as kind of the spine of the play, and then we're branching off from there?
You could. I mean, it really does. Branching off, we like that. It really does cover that progression that you really are trying to convey to the kids. And, if we compare that, I'll have to compare it to the scope of work, but I'm pretty sure it's really close. I do want to get that emphasis of science in there. I think that's really important. So if we, follow the points in the scope of work, I do think Ponderosa Peat is going to give you a really good outline of what you're trying
And I guess my other question would be is when 5,000 kids go home and they're sitting around the dinner table, what do you want them to say? What do you want them to take with them?
What's their take-home message?
Right.
You want to answer that, Karen?
You can all answer it separately, so you
Yeah.
can come up with it.
Well, probably some, well, as an educator, this is the way I think. You want to tell somebody anything new, you want to relate it to something they already know, right? And you want to try to nurture that awareness and appreciation. All learning, that's really what it starts with. And then once you kind of are aware and you start to appreciate something like the forest, then you want to start knowing more about all these interrelationships, about the history, about this, and it's kind of more the meat of the story. And then really the next step in this particular model of learning is like, how can you apply it? You know, what are actions or what are, you know, understandings you can share? So I kind of think it is sort of a three-part thing. How you know, awareness and appreciation is kind of the hook. Then here's, you know, how the story develops, all these interrelationships, and really a lot of these are like the ecological interrelationships that we're talking about here. But then it's kind of like the third part is, so what hope for the future, things you can do, you can be, you know, more maybe understanding or know why there's smoke in the air sometimes during the year, why fires are burning, you know, why this, and he talks about climate change. It's kind of the big question mark here. You know, there's definitely, the future is going to need more Pete's, more researchers into this. So maybe, you know, something. So I guess that's the take home is kind of what now? What's in, you know, what holds for the future? How can we better appreciate and understand the situation of force? Does that help sort of answer it? I was in drama in high school and college.
Well, get up on stage.
Yeah. I have this whole great activity based on a learning guide called Project Learning Tree. It's about using trees in forests is kind of our window into learning really more about the world around us. And there's this one great activity, and it's based on all these parts of a tree that Pete mentioned, and they all have an action and a sound effect. So you talk about xylem, which is a wonderful word in science. Just a little short word, I mean, it begins with an X. How many words? You know? And xylem pumps the water from the soil all the way to the very tippy top of that tree, because that very top pine needle or leaf needs water. So, and the action I use is water. Anyways, they're all activities that are really fun to do with her.
Yeah, you know, I think you were also trying to convey sustainability for future generations. We want to protect our forests. Can you imagine if our forests all broke down all around here? Could you imagine what it would be like, how depressing it would be? So just like Karen said, it's awareness and appreciation. That is so huge, especially in our young people. We want them to appreciate and protect and want to sustain the natural resources around them. And especially in this electronic age, I think this is such a good way to reach kids because you're doing a live performance, you're teaching them, and we're really teaching them these deep-seated values that we want them to take home with them and take to their parents. So, you know, those are some of the bigger issues.